Yeah, I can't really make an argument for anybody but Jamar Chase at number one. Honestly, not even worth talking about. Going down to tier two, I'm going to be ignoring the fact that he has a week 14 bye. At this point, obviously, you understand if you need to win week 14, you probably go through and lower those options down. But we will have Nico Collins. Over the past 2 weeks, since Nico Collins has effectively been 100% or back to his usual 70 to 80% of the snaps in this Texans offense, you've seen 20 fantasy points pretty much back-to-back weeks. We go back through the first 4 weeks that we had where he was getting up there 80+% of the snaps played. You have 17, 27, 12, and 33 points. So pretty much any game where Nico Collins has been healthy so far this season, he has averaged about 20 fantasy points per contest. Now, of course, I will say with Nico, this is a worse offense than we were initially expecting it to be, but also you have no Diggs and Tank Dell is an absolute pumpkin. So at the end of the day, Nico's just going to dominate the target share. Amon-Ra St. Brown in a much better offense, but just going to see fewer targets, right? With St. Brown, you only have 2 games so far this season with fewer than 10 fantasy points scored, whereas you're looking at a total of, I want to say, 5 games with 20 or more points. Best offense in the league. The issue is they're going to run the ball consistently. Going over to A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, you can make an argument to have higher than this depending on the injury that we have with Devonta Smith. For me personally, I am expecting that Smith should be good to go this week, but obviously I could be 100% wrong there. Going over to Justin Jefferson, you get the bounce back against Arizona with the 16 fantasy points, but you haven't had a game with more than 20 fantasy points since back in week 9. And with Justin Jefferson, the best game you've had all season is about 21 points. So the consistency in the floor has been there, but the issue that you've had with Jefferson is the ceiling hasn't necessarily. Going over to Drake London. London, we actually see the 16 targets against the Los Angeles Chargers. Obviously, Kirk Cousins will implode when going up against a very strong defense. I think we've kind of learned that about Cousins at this point of his career. But London dominating targets. Kyle Pitts is a 0. And Darnell Mooney's really the only competition that you have. Puka Nacua does have a considerable amount of competition, but still at the same time, it is a concentrated offense where the only guy you're going to have to see touch the ball outside of him is Kupp and then the occasional Demarcus Robinson vulture. But if we're looking at Nacua, this is a receiver that since he threw the punch against the Seattle Seahawks, you've seen 18, 25, 20, and 17 points. So effectively he is sitting here averaging about 20 fantasy points per game in games where he has fully played, and there's no reason to believe that's not going to be the case going into the future. I'm going over to Mike Evans. We finally get him back playing his 80+% of the snaps against the Carolina Panthers. You get the 25 fantasy points, the 12 targets. You have no Godwin, no super strong wide receiver with a very large sample of dominance. I'm going down to our next tier. I understand that Cooper Kupp gives you the dud against the Saints. In reality, going into the future, I don't think you have to worry about that being a consistent thing with Kupp. You look at the prior 5 weeks that we had since coming back from his injury, you are averaging about 20 fantasy points per game. I think the offense should be great. Not only should the offense be great, but again, it's an extremely concentrated offense as well. CeeDee Lamb, the reports are that the shoulder is not going to be something you have to be concerned with going into week 14. Obviously, only plays 67% of the snaps against the Giants due to the shoulder. But yeah, I think with Lamb, if he is 100% healthy, you should see him go back to about double-digit targets every single week. Or, I mean, you had 6 games straight with at least 10 targets. I'm going over to Tyreek Hill. This is a receiver that has not had double-digit targets since back in week 5. Obviously, he gets there against the Packers in absolute garbage time. I still stand by. I think that Tyreek, while he's of course not the player that you drafted him to be, he's still somebody that you absolutely have to start. Like the only games where Tua has played in full, we've seen 26, 12, 12, 19, 10, and 20 fantasy points scored. So definitely not an elite wide receiver one, but I still think a must-start player. T. Higgins, definitely a must-start option, right? This is the best passing offense in the NFL. And if you're going through and looking at what we have since Higgins has made it back from his injury, you are looking at a total of 2 games with fewer than 15 points. Obviously, dating back to week 3. And if you remove week 3, his first week back from his initial injury, you only have one game with fewer than 15 points, and that was 14.5 going up against the Giants. So Higgins has been an absolute crusher in effectively any game that he's been healthy based off how strong the volume is in this offense. Terry McLaurin is the wide receiver 5 in total fantasy points scored. Now, obviously, he's played every single game, right? So if you're looking at points per game, that is going to be very different. You'd have to deal with the week 14 bye, but again, I'm not taking into account the bye weeks too much in these rankings. Going over to Garrett Wilson. With Wilson, I do want to reiterate that this is very similar to what you have with the Rams. We say it every single week, every video. You're tired of hearing it, but it's a super concentrated offense. The difference between the Jets and the Rams, the Jets is a much worse offense, but the only guys that are going to touch the ball here will be Garrett Wilson and Davante Adams. Maybe a sprinkle in a little bit Tyler Conklin, but there's not a third wide receiver. And I mean, some of these teams, like say George Pickens is not one of these. Pickens, you do have the concentration of targets among the wide receivers, but obviously they're spreading things among running backs and tight ends. But like going over to Courtland Sutton and the Denver Broncos, I mean, Sutton is absolutely crushed, but a big thing is like in Denver, you actually have a ton of different wide receivers that catch the ball. It is spread out a decent amount, which is why I do think that Underdog is actually lowering the expectations for Courtland Sutton with the game tonight. I mean, with Sutton over the past 5 weeks, you've actually seen his low be 70 receiving yards. It's been the worst week that you've had. That was against the Kansas City Chiefs. And Underdog right now has Courtland Sutton higher, lower 61.5 total yards. I personally did take the higher on the live stream on Sunday night. But of course, if you wanted to tell us on that, you can find the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description in the comment section. Code FLOCK will get you up with a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, you'll be getting a free Jameis Winston pick, more than less than half a total yard for the Monday night game. And on top of that, you'll be getting a free team review in the live stream that we're doing every night. Now, going over to Ladd McConkey, we're looking at a receiver that finally eclipsed 10 plus targets in this game against the Atlanta Falcons. He had 117 receiving yards in a game where Justin Herbert had about 170 passing yards. So if you're looking at Ladd McConkey and Malik Neighbors, from a market share perspective, it's very similar. They're going to absolutely dominate their offenses. They're going to have absolutely everything. Now, the one potential difference that you could have between Ladd and Neighbors is, for me personally, I just give the benefit of the doubt to Justin Herbert, thinking that he possibly is a better shot to fix his offense and actually to have passing volume there in comparison to what we have with the Giants. I'm going over to DK Metcalf. Metcalf's been super disappointing. Like, I traded for this dude 3 weeks ago, and since then you've had 14, 10, and 10 fantasy points. Obviously, against the Jets, he does leave the game. He doesn't play full. He sounds good. Sounds like the injury is not going to be a major concern. He does dominate with targets with 9, but JSN's look phenomenal. Davante Adams will be our next option. Again, I want to reiterate with Adams, just super concentrated offense that you have here in New York. I mean, really, you only have Adams and Wilson touching the ball. That's it. Going over to our next name, we are going to be looking at Jackson Smith-Njigba. JSN has his 5th straight game with double-digit fantasy points, and you actually only have 3 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points for JSN so far this season, and you have 3 games with 20 or more. Over the past 4 games that Seattle's played, JSN's led this team in total fantasy points each and every week. Again, against the Jets, you didn't have Metcalf playing every snap, and at the same time, Metcalf did have the 9 targets in comparison to JSN at 4. So I will slightly still prefer Metcalf over Njigba. Going over to Marvin Harrison, we have really had an up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down stretch over the past 6 weeks, where you're looking at the 5 points, then up to 23, then down to 3, then up to 16, then down to 7, then up to 17. So he's been very inconsistent. You did have before the game on Sunday, this coaching staff coming through and saying that Marvin Harrison was going to be the focal point of their offense going into the future. You do have 12 targets, which is a career high. Obviously, that is very encouraging, but I definitely want to see him be able to string together a few of these great performances. I'm going over to Zay Flowers. With Flowers, you have not had a game with 15 or more fantasy points since back in week 9 against the Denver Broncos. With Zay Flowers, this is a receiver that you really shouldn't expect a ton of passing volume in his offense. Instead, obviously, if Baltimore is going to win the game, they should be able to run the ball relatively easily, and you have to deal with the week 14 bye for Flowers. Jaden Reed was a pretty easy start against Miami, considering the fact that he had no Romeo Doubs. But in week 14, if you have Romeo Doubs coming back in, then at that point, you're probably in a spot where we should expect the target volume to really be extremely dispersed here in Green Bay, where you're getting Doubs, Reed, Watson, Wicks, and Kraft all involved, not to mention Jacobs. And yeah, you're really just banking on the efficiency. And I will say, from a fantasy points per target perspective this season, Jaden Reed has to literally be off the charts. I can't imagine there's a single receiver close to Reed. Going over to Devonta Smith, super frustrating, right? Against Dallas, you had 3 points. Against Washington, you had 6. Week 12, he doesn't play. Week 13, he doesn't play. But with him being a game time decision in week 13, I'm kind of going to operate on the assumption that he should be good to go for week 14. Dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go ahead and put Jacoby Myers here. If you are looking at Myers, I mean, this is a receiver that's had 2 games with 20 or more fantasy points this season, and you've had 4 games with fewer than 10. So really, I think the floor is pretty low. The ceiling's not super high. But you are the number 1 wide receiver in your offense in particular. Now, of course, I will mention that while you may be the number 1 wide receiver, you're not the number 1 passing down option or passing game option. That is going to be Brock Bowers. And I'm expecting it to be one of the worst offenses in the NFL. So it's not like I'm super excited about what we have with Myers in general. I'm going over to Chris Olave. Olave missed week 10, week 11. Week 12 was the bye, so that doesn't count. Week 13 on the IR. So Olave at the very minimum is going to miss week 14 as well. And Olave potentially could come back in week 15 to an offense that has no Shaheed and no Taysom. So he would just absolutely dominate the targets if he were to come back. But again, it would be a very bad offense. So I think you have to put him in the same range as guys like Myers. I'm going over to DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins seized the 9 targets against the Raiders this past week, back-to-back games with double-digit fantasy points. But still, Hopkins only plays 59% of the snaps, right? So you are going to naturally have a cap ceiling with Hopkins. Looking at Juwan Jennings and Deebo Samuel, I don't know. I think we just kind of have to wave the flag. I don't know how excited we can be about this offense going into the future. You had an implied team total putting the Niners as a bottom 5 offense in the NFL in week 13. Obviously, you can blame the weather. You can blame the injuries. You can blame whatever the hell you want. But I don't know. They fall flat. It's hard to be excited about anybody in this offense, especially now that you have the CMC injury. I think you very easily could see the Niners just kind of going through and packing it in. Not to mention that you're in a spot in which, I mean, if they lose CMC, then at that point, are you more likely than not seeing them shut down Purdy if he's dealing with the shoulder? And then going over to Brian Thomas, I'm making this ranking under the assumption that they will be shutting down Lawrence rest of season after the concussion. I mean, they're 2-10. They have no reason to bring him back. DJ Moore absolutely dominates back-to-back weeks here. You get 27 points against Minnesota, 23 points against Detroit. Now, obviously, Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze are both seeing a ton of targets as well. So I'm going to be a little bit hesitant with DJ Moore, but 100% trending in the right direction. I think you make an argument easily to have him at the top of this tier. And again, that's why we do this in tier lists. If you want to move Darnell Mooney to the top of this tier, you do you. I mean, with Mooney, you assume that he's 100% healthy going into the future. And again, I mean, you are really just living and dying by the passing volume that you're going to have in this offense with Cousins. And good matchups, Mooney could be great. Obviously, it all comes down to what you're going to have with the matchup and the projections for this offense. But you can say that about a lot of the receivers in this range. Going over to our last tier, we're going to have Calvin Ridley as a wide receiver that's in a garbage offense. Not only in a garbage offense, but he actually is not up there at the top of his team in fantasy points at the wide receiver position over the past month. You have Nick Westbrook-Ikhine coming on strong. Don't get me wrong. I'm not excited about Nick Westbrook-Ikhine. For the love of God, don't buy into a 29-year-old's all of a sudden breakout wide receiver with Will Levis. It's not happening. But still, I am maybe 27 years old. I apologize. Regardless, Nick Westbrook-Akeen's not a super big deal, but I think he does eat into Calvin Ridley a bit. At least that's what we've seen. Jerry Jeudy, I would have ranked a lot higher in my rankings for tonight because you have no Cedric Tillman with the concussion. But when we get back to week 14 and Tillman is back in, then at that point, I think you do have to maybe be a little bit more concerned about Jerry Jeudy. Jordan Addison, a boom bust option where you're hunting for a touchdown. I hope we get some into the future for my underdog teams. Khalil Shakir has had really good market share numbers here in Buffalo over the past 2 to 3 weeks, but you've also had no Kincaid and no Keon Coleman. If we get Kincaid and Keon back in week 14, I think Shakir goes down. Waddle is a receiver that back-to-back weeks here has been strong. You actually see a season high 92% of the snaps against the Packers, but I don't know. It looks like this is Jonnu's offense. Jamison Williams actually has had back-to-back games with 7 targets, which is encouraging. Main thing is you're hoping for the big touchdown. And then Amari Cooper, I'm ready to just go through and wave the white flag and say it's not happening. I thought Amari was going to be the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo once he was traded there. And of course, that looks absolutely horrendous. Amari, since his first game in Buffalo, has scored a total of, about 12 fantasy points through 3 games played. So it's been a disaster. But hopefully it's not a disaster to go with Cortland Sutton higher than 61.5 receiving yards for tonight's game. Of course, if you want to tell us on that, you can find that link in the description, comment section. Promo code FLOCK, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000, plus that free Jameis Winston pick, more than less than half a total yard, and a free team review in the live stream we're doing every single night. I do want to warn y'all, though, with our underdog calls this season, we are approximately 1 for 1,082. So it's been rough. But again, I really appreciate you, and I really hope we get to see you out in the live stream later today.